Hello, this is Jay Mitchell. We are back for another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Greg Bavino recent speech and parentheses humor posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross post from the Trump virus subreddit, looking a lot like January 2026. And that looks like the video of I've seen this video on this subreddit before of it's how it's two Nazis hanging up Nazi flags, and then some guy says, "Oh, you guys are Nazis," and they're like, "Oh, you can't call us Nazis." And that's how it's very much how Reddit acts. They think everyone who dissents at all is a literal Nazi, even though personally I disagree with pretty much all of Trump's doing, but Reddit would still call me a Nazi for thinking he's more par for the course than the worst thing ever. And that just goes to show you that Reddit isn't real life. It's a bunch of losers who live in their mother's basements. It's very much a loser website for losers. They suspended me again recently for harassment, but yet, the leftists there are allowed to harass people as much as they feel like, and that just goes to show you, it's pretty much a DNC propaganda hell website at this point. I don't like Trump, as I said earlier. I think he's a very bad president whose spazzery constantly gets in his own way. But Reddit is, after going on Reddit, I never voted for him in any three of his elections. But if you go on Reddit, if you go on Reddit, I'm kind of sad I didn't vote for him all three times. And it just goes to show you that Reddit, all social media is propaganda, but Reddit is in particular is very, very bad DNC propaganda. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have breaking. The U.S. was supposed to attack Iran on January 14th, but the attack was called off at the last minute due to insufficient forces and an unclear goal other than benefiting Israel. That same day, Iran closed their airspace, meaning they knew about it, according to Al Monitor. And then they had a screenshot breaking. The U.S. was supposed to attack Iran on January 14th. The attack was called off last minute due to insufficient forces in the region, unclear goal of Operation Al Monitor. And they link to the article from Al Monitor. And yeah, personally, that was posted by Row Run Row. And yeah, personally, I'm surprised the U.S. didn't do the attack. The U.S. usually does whatever Israel wants it to. So that's why I'm surprised the U.S. didn't go through with it. But regardless, this is just the rare exception rather than the rule. 99 times out of 100, when Israel wants something from the U.S. is going to give it to them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, the left doesn't want you to know this about the investigation of Ilhan Omar's finances, posted from pjmedia.com, posted by Mundane Image 13, and that's a cross post from the conservative subreddit. And yeah, personally, I do think, they should be investigating everyone's finances, regardless of which branch of the Uniparty they're a part of. Ultimately, Reddit's not going to care because Ilhan Omar has the magical D next to her name that erases all criticism whatsoever. But, ultimately, I do think everyone should be held accountable, regardless of what letter they have next to their name. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump. With that being said, you can't have guns. You can't walk in with guns. You just can't. You can't walk in with guns. You can't do that. But it's just a very unfortunate incident. Posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit, and that looks like Donald Trump saying that, I guess, on Real America's Voice, on the a clip from Real America's Voice, or Charlie Kirk show. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is that he's wrong there. Trump is very much, he can say some good stuff about guns sometimes, but the thing with Donald Trump is he'll say whatever he feels at any given moment. So you can pretty much find quotes of him saying, pretty pro-gun stuff, but also pretty anti-gun stuff. That's very much, he always likes to play both sides, so he can always come out on top. But yeah, Trump, just like everyone else, I feel like 80%, 90% maybe, and even 95% of people want guns, but only for the in-group rather than the out-group. If Alex Preddy was in Trump's in-group rather than his out-group, Reddit would think Trump would say he was completely justified having a gun, but since he was he's in his out-group, suddenly, he shouldn't have been having a gun. And that just goes to show you that, Trump's pretty much just the anti-Reddit in that regard. Reddit has a lot of problems with automatically being against anything Trump says, and Trump, will automatically, is kind of the opposite. He's gonna be for whatever he says, but it's just because Reddit, they're gonna have their agenda, Trump's gonna have his agenda. That's why I personally think you always gotta be aware of what people's agenda are. That's why I personally think, the libertarians should be support the Second Amendment, because ultimately that's the one thing that keeps all people equal, is the right to bear arms. When there's no other law, when there's no when all law does fail, ultimately the only thing that does matter is the law of physics. How fast does a bullet travel, et cetera, et cetera. And that just goes to show you that I think libertarians need to support the Second Amendment. And Donald Trump, just like like a lot of Republicans, are very wishy-washy about it, even though they sometimes can say good things, at least better things than the Democrats, which is also a very low bar to clear. Next, we have cognitive dissonance, and that's the meme of the guy with pressing the two buttons. But that's from Cal Dog goes by Cal Dog, and one button says ICE using the pretext of child rapists for deportations, and the other button says putting a child rapist in the White House, and then the guy's labeled the Republican dilemma. And yeah, personally, ultimately, I don't know if Trump's a child rapist. I definitely do think he was on Epstein Island a lot, but Epstein Island, all the Epstein stuff was an Israeli blackmail operation by the Israeli CIA and Mossad to blackmail the elites like Donald Trump. So I personally don't know if he's a child rapist, but they probably he probably is definitely adjacent to child rape. Like pretty much all the elites are probably part of a it's interesting. For years, an elite pedophile ring was considered a conspiracy, but now with all the Epstein Island stuff, it's pretty much a fact. And it just goes to show you that you can't trust the elites and all the stuff they might have on them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, I don't care if this is controversial, American troops should not die in a war against Iran that only benefits Israel, posted by Row Run Row. And I would agree with that. But sadly, Israel usually gets what it wants 99 times out of 100 when it comes to the U.S. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the closest Alex Petty got to an ICE operation happening on the other side of the street, posted by Fasty Ruinous 739, and that's across with from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And yeah, personally, if it just goes to show you that I personally don't think he should have been killed. But ultimately, if I was someone like him, he should be avoiding ICE agents rather than directly confronting them, because they have the legal monopoly on the use of force to justify taking you out whenever they feel like, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. I think it's interesting. I like Reddit says they're going to stop it. It constantly tries to troll and irk them whenever possible. Not all Redditors, first, a lot of them don't leave their parents' basement, but definitely the ones that go outside seem to like to troll ICE as much as possible. And that just goes to show you that if you want to justify taking your life in your hands and trolling ICE as much as possible, that's fine. But don't be surprised if you're when you're on top of someone 24/7, be they a government agent or not, that they get eventually annoyed, and if they have access to guns, they eventually justify using them. Next, we have Jeremy Kaufman is setting the bar low for human decency, posted by, and that's a tweet from Claybine, or post from Claybine, and then it's a link for Twitter from Justin O'Donnell tweeted, today Jeremy Kaufman set the bar for human decency so fucking low that a leprechaun was able to step over it with no effort, and it's a screenshot of his tweets. And it was Jeremy Kaufman tweeted, why are libertarians lamenting the death of a far-left agitator? What happened? And then Michael Heiss replied, they have souls. And then Jeremy Kaufman replied, we were supposed to help resist libertarians from leftist catcher, but you turned out to be just as leftist as Cato or Reason. Enjoy Pennsylvania. And then the OP added, Kaufman has gone so off base that the chair of the Mises Caucus, Michael Heiss, sided with fact and reason. Kaufman is such a fascist that he labels Cato, owned by conservatarian Koch, and Reason as leftists, never celebrated the downfall of a man so profusely. And yeah, personally, if you want to think that far left agitators don't have souls, you should be able to do so. Think you don't want to have souls or whatever, believe. Personally, I think everyone has a soul, but I definitely don't care for a lot of communists, and you don't have to mourn his death, but that doesn't justify what the state did, I would say. And I think that should very much be the libertarian position. If you want to mourn his death, that's fine, but they definitely shouldn't be celebrating ICE being the one to kill him, even if you're one of the people who argues that he was in the wrong. And that's my thoughts there. Jeremy Kaufman is, of course, he always is trying to, he always likes to bait social media with edgy posts like this, and it just goes to show you that social media is very much whoever baits the best, and that just goes to show, eventually people have gotten tired of it, and that's why I think social media is on its way out, kind of. People are just tired of being constantly baited and all the constant outrage fatigue. Eventually, I think people are going to get more settled into in real doing IRL stuff than being on social media, and that's why I think social media is just increasingly bots and foreigners at this point. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Ilhan Omar attacked and sprayed with substance as she was calling for Secretary Noem to resign or face impeachment, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Underreported News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think you should be throwing stuff at her. Obviously, it's not someone I particularly care for. We shouldn't be throwing any substances or things at her. With that being said, if she was in group rather than out group, or if she was out group rather than in group, Reddit would be saying this is a false flag, and that just goes to show you, everyone's always gonna have their excuses whenever it comes to what's happening to the politicians on their side. In reality, I think it's all just theater. They all pretty much agree on everything, even if they might use a few wedge issues like immigration, LGBTQ, or abortion to divide people. They agree on like 95% of stuff, and they just use stuff like this as a distraction to show distract from, that they're all committing fraud. There was a post earlier, Epstein, Ilhan Omar's is under investigation for fraud, and that stuff like this is just going to distract from that. Same with, the Epstein files. Now Donald Trump's going into Venezuela. He's pushing for a war with Iran, and he's having ICE all over the place. It's very much how, it's very much how the news cycle works. It's whatever the current thing is, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have protesters on sidewalk nodding, peeing ice, get drive-by maced by ICE, in parentheses terrorist, out of spite, pure spite, posted by receiver locks, and that's a cross-post from the Trump virus subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think ICE should be pepper spraying people on the sidewalk, even if they're being annoying. But, ultimately, ICE has legal states legal monopolies to force justify whatever they want to. So I purposely wouldn't be out of my way agitating them. But, you justify doing what you want to justify. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Border Patrol agents started the scuffle that led to Alex Preddy's death from Reason.com, posted by Maddie O'Clock. And I guess I would agree with that. It's definitely not like an Renee Good where it really could go either way. I definitely do think the ICE agents are definitely the ones who are more responsible than Preddy was. But ultimately, if I was him, I probably would be avoiding ICE rather than actively being confrontational and following them around. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have how private prisons sued the state of Arizona for not having enough prisoners from posted from hrnews1.substack.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, if anyone wants to sue for whatever reason, I think they should be able to. But I don't really care for prisons, but I do think, like for everything, they should be private rather than public. But with that being said, there's not enough prisoners. Sometimes you just have to cope with that. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, the prison is kind of inherently a libertarian idea, but you do have to put violent criminals somewhere. And I do think, prison is the right place. And like for everything, libertarians support the private sector over the public sector. The private sector tends to, do things a little more efficiently. But ultimately, prisons are something that's kind of inherently anti-libertarian. But you do have to, as I said earlier, you have to put the violent criminals somewhere. Next, we have slander or propaganda, posted by What About the 90s, and they said, every time I browse Reddit and X, you see liberals bashing libertarians, lumping libertarians with MAGA. Did I miss something? Trump is quite arguably the most authoritarian president in modern history. Why on earth would people associate MAGA with libertarianism? Is that there some kind of smear campaign going on? I know the other libertarian subreddits were hijacked by MAGA, but that would not be this massive conspiracy. And yeah, personally, a lot of libertarians kind of right-coded to people. Of course, on Reddit, anything other than progressivism or straight-up communism is going to be right-coded to people. So, ultimately, if they want to say that libertarians are MAGA, I think they should be able to. But that being said, I think a lot of libertarians, they might agree with Trump on some stuff like economics, at least compared to Biden and Obama. But regardless, I would say the libertarian position is that Trump's just a par for the course authoritarian, which they would call me a Nazi for that, because you need to think Trump's the worst thing ever, or you're literally Hitler. and that's pretty much how Reddit works. Next, we have city prosecutors join forces to bring charges against federal agents from nytimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they said the organization, which is called the Project for the Fight Against Federal Overreach, will also include Mary Moriarty, the elected prosecutor in Minneapolis. Its acronym, FAFO, references a slang term for negative consequences, of course, fuck around, find out, and its formation was spurred by growing concerns about warrantless entries, unlawful detentions, and coercive enforcement tactics by federal agents, according to a news release. And yeah, personally, if the local government wants to go against the federal government, I think they should be able to. But that being said, ultimately the federal government's going to be superior. The Civil War proves that. Slavery definitely, especially the South's version of chattel slavery, which exclusively enslaved African Americans, that wasn't good. But I definitely do think having the federal government prove it was ultimately superior to the state governments was a bad idea for the long run, because now you can have ICE agents in whatever state the president wants to send them to, and it just goes to show you that it might having the federal government be superior might sound like a good thing, but in reality, the libertarian position is we support some state and local governments over the federal government, because when the federal government is the most powerful one, suddenly the state and local governments have no power at all. But with that being said, the libertarian support individuals over any form of government, be it state, local, or federal, because the individual is ultimately the driving unit of society and the ultimate focus of the libertarian project, I would say. Next, we have Some Political Cartoons Really Nail It from TheoCarsonian.com, posted by Plasman30, and that looks like some political cartoon some guy did, Occam's Razor, and it's a picture of that Pretty and the Good. It says, pretty good, time for a revolution. And yeah, personally, I think it's been time for a revolution for a while, but sadly, I think the American people are too complacent these days to do a revolution. Social media, people just would circle jerk themselves off on social media. Ideological masturbation, it kind of is. And rather than actually actively trying to protect their own liberty, they're just too busy, circle jerking off themselves on social media. And that's why I'm glad social media didn't come about until relatively recently. Imagine it during the American Revolution or the Civil War, maybe during the American Revolution, the U.S. would just block words the third on Twitter, instead of actually fought a war against them. And it just goes to show you that, people are lazy, and eventually, people, I don't know if a revolution will come anytime soon, but I definitely do think, social media has just made people a lot more complacent in that regard. Next, we have ICE agents attempt to enter Ecuadorian consulate in Minneapolis, triggering geopolitical row, from TimesNowNews.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross-post from the geopolitics subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think ICE agents should be entering the embassies of or consulates of foreign countries, but ultimately, people are going to justify, and since ICE has the federal government on its side, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. A lot of people are going to defer to what the federal government or what the president says, and sometimes there's nothing you really can do about it, as I just said. Next, we have Rand Paul. I don't know who trusts an investigation done by DHS when they're the ones calling this person an assassin, a domestic terrorist, saying he was assaulting the police. How can they be in charge of an independent investigation? Something's got to happen here. Posted by CH4Locks, and that's a crosspost from the We the Fifth subreddit. I guess that's Rand Paul saying that on Fox Business, And yeah, personally, Rand Paul, a lot of Redditors don't like him because he's right-coded rather than progressive, communist, or left-coded. But, he usually is right on stuff like this. Just because the Department of Homeland Security can say something, it's like they say, oh, we investigated ourselves and found no wrongdoing. It just goes to show you that, I think the libertarian position is we gotta abolish DHS, just like pretty much every government agency created after 1900 or so, because they're just the deep state who's really running the show rather than the actual elected officials in Congress like Rand Paul here. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Border Patrol agents killed Alex Preddy. Why is Border Patrol in Minneapolis at all? From Reason.com, posted by Fear the Creeper. And they added, federal agencies have considerable authority outside their given jurisdiction, even when they don't have the training to match. And I'd agree with that, I don't think Border Patrol should be in Minnesota, but ultimately the U.S. government can send whatever federal agencies it wants to whatever state it wants to. It's why I think the only way out at this point is if either Minnesota's kicked out of the Union or Minnesota secedes from the Union, because right now, the Founding Fathers' arguable greatest failure was secession. By not allowing states to decide when they could secede from the Union, suddenly the federal government has all the power and the state and local governments have no power. Next we have Agent says you raise your voice, I erase your voice. Do not call them ICE anymore. But posted by Ragnarok XG, and that's a YouTube video from Park Rose Permaculture, and then the OP had, I agree with this. We need to stop it with the acronym and call them what they are: Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And yeah, personally, if you call them whatever you feel like, if they take offense to it and want to act against you, people will just fight to justify. But ultimately, I definitely, as I said numerous times, picking fights to fight isn't a good idea. They have the legal monopoly on the use of fight of the state on their side. If you don't risk pissing them off and justify having them maybe shoot at you, ultimately, do whatever you want to. But that being said, that kind of it sounds like a very stupid idea for me. But justify doing whatever you want to. It's I don't really care for people like Alex Preddy. We probably disagree on a lot, but at the very least, the man was willing to stand up for his principles. That's something that's very rare, especially these days. People are just too busy jerking themselves out on social media than actively standing up for their principles in real life. Next we have It's True in General, It's Double True for Leftists, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the Armed Socialist subreddit. And it's looks like an ICE agent with a pig mask, and he's all covered in blood paint. And then there's a guy. He's going to point to a guy kneeling on the ground, and then the guy kneeling on the ground, his silhouette says, "This could be you." And I would agree with that. Ultimately, anyone could be at the mercy of the U.S. government. That's why I personally try and avoid any kind of government agents unless I need them in it. But it just goes to show you that you should keep to yourself. Just go running up and trying to annoy government agents as much as possible isn't going to have a happy ending if this graffiti says. Next, we have TikTok users in the U.S. can't write obscenity anti-Trump videos from theindependent.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I think that kind of goes against freedom of speech. But, ultimately, TikTok's a private platform that can do whatever it wants to. And, if they want to do that, I personally think that it might have been more free speech oriented under the old Chinese regime, but regardless, each regime of whoever's running a social media company is going to have its own censorship regime. Reddit has tons of censorship issues as well, but the subreddit never complains about it. It has Uncensored in the name. It's had me censored for a year and a half now, and it just goes to show you that people only care about censorship when it goes against their narratives. I'm sure if it was censoring anything about the Joe Biden's corruption in Ukraine or any Democrat corruption for that matter, Reddit would sweep it under the rug or think it's the greatest thing ever. And it just goes to show you, censorship. People see their principle when it comes to stuff like censorship, but it's just very much like the Second Amendment. They just want free speech for their side. They don't care about free speech for the other side. Just like how they want firearms for their side, but they don't want firearms for the other side. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have They Actually Don't Understand Per Capita, posted by Successful Mango 848, and that's a cross post they made from the sociology subreddit. Why is the quote-unquote black criminal narrative so dominant? White Americans lead in the raw volume of almost all crime categories. And yeah, personally, I think as this guy says, it's more of a per capita thing. Some people might say it's because blacks are genetically inferior. I know Jeremy Kaufman has the argument that it's a genetic thing. But, personally, I think it's much more of a nurture argument than a nature one. I think the black community in the U.S. is historically poorer and more urban than most of the other racial and ethnic groups. I think that's probably why the black crime rate tends to be higher. And, that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.